Hey internets, time for another Gamerant, which if you are new here, these are video essays with some retro gaming and memes over here on the side that usually have something to do with the subject. Today's video is going to feature F-Zero and actually be part 2 to a previous Gamerant I did about how to identify wokeness. I realized in that video I spent a little bit too much time explaining why the definition of wokeness I gave made the most sense and not enough time on, actual methods to identify what is and what isn't woke in the wild. So to remedy that, I will now be bringing you 5 additional methods to detect wokery in this video. For a quick recap, I defined wokeness in the first video as an aggressive push for diversity, equity, inclusion, usually based on the belief that outcomes which lack these things is indicative of discrimination or unfair social treatment. This time I will not be elaborating further on that. If you are interested in why I believe this is a solid definition, feel free to watch part 1, which I'll link at the end. Anyways, number 1, the first identifier of wokeness I want to add is an easy one to recognize, but strangely I haven't heard many people call this one out, and that's bad faith and strawman arguments. Many people are aware that wokeness is really just the logical evolution of the progressive left social justice movement from roughly 10 to 20 years ago. One of the things that made that movement so annoying and toxic was, if you think about it, its tendency to try and make everything offensive. To always take what is said in the worst possible light and then use that bad faith interpretation to viciously attack someone. For example, take a seemingly innocent statement like, "I find it attractive when women smile." Now, the good faith interpretation of that is the guy likes a woman with a positive attitude and thus finds a lady with a fine smile appealing. No ill will towards a woman in general need be interpreted from such a simple statement. But of course, an SJW could come in and absolutely blow their cap off in an almost rabid-like anger. "Oh my god, you must be one of those crazy misogynies who thinks women should be legally forced to smile, and you must believe we must convert our society to the Gilead world of A Handmaid's Tale and blah 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 re. Now, which is probably the more likely interpretation meant by the person making the statement that they are attracted to a smiling woman? Probably the former. In fact, even amongst the farthest cultural right I know, you usually won't find a consensus that we should emulate A Handmaid's Tale. The only time you'll see that are usually people just memeing, they're not actually serious. It's actually really extremely unlikely that anyone who says something like that unironically means it as some kind of weird dog whistle for taking women's rights away. But of course, to the SJWs, that doesn't matter, because their goal was of course to find the things to be offended by, not to actually genuinely fix those things. And that's why when something can be interpreted in 1,000 different ways, and 999 are completely innocuous, but one interpretation can be seen as socially offensive, they would latch onto that one single little offensive interpretation like a rabid animal, and refuse to let go and demand you apologize and repent for your sins of harming their subjective feelings, and acknowledge their moral superiority. Now, eventually people caught on and realized that this behavior is very cringe, hence why SJWs got relentlessly made fun of to the point where their foolishness could arguably be traced to the main reason that Donald Trump got elected. But here's the thing, with wokeness, the bad faith and tendency to strawman is still there. SJWs may have evolved and gotten a little bit better at optics, but the general idea is still very much there. It's just that now, instead of attacking individual subjective interpretations, which to be honest they still occasionally do, they now have moved their bad faith arguments towards attacking broader ideologies. A very simple example of this kind of wokeness is when Adam Something made his video on how right libertarians are all secretly fascistos. The goal of it was, of course, not to treat libertarianism with a good faith, but to strawman it as much as possible to make it look evil. Why? Same reason as before, to achieve a feeling of moral superiority. So it's the same bad faith shit, just in a different format, and when you think about this alongside the definition of wokeness, it actually makes perfect sense why they would do this. To maintain the false belief that anything that doesn't produce an equitable outcome is discriminatory, they are therefore forced to paint anything that would say otherwise as bad. This brings me to number 2, which is that woketoids are often very dishonest, or at least very clueless about what wokeness is, kinda going hand in hand with the bad faith aspect. No, really, if you ask someone who subscribes to woke ideology what wokeness is, they often have absolutely no idea at all, or they'll give a very strange, just completely wrong interpretation. They give these often stupidly sarcastic, arrogant answers like, "Oh, wokeness is just what white ringers say when they see a black person," or "Woke just means being aware of capitalism being bad, man," or "Wokeness is just what conservatives say when they don't like something." These are, of course, completely incorrect. Wokeness is effectively just the results of Western culture adopting the equity fallacy as a false axiom. It somewhat bleeds into the ideological robot problem and the righteous mind again, where the far left doesn't actually know or understand what people to the right of them believe, and so they just kind of strawman them constantly. So to them, they take the very concept of what it is meant by criticism of wokery in bad faith as well. Since they assume a lack of equity means there is most likely a source of discrimination, they assume that those who criticize this claim must be intentionally trying to cause that very discrimination boogeyman they believe in. So this cluelessness in itself becomes a good sign you're probably talking to a wokedoid, because it renders them unable to comprehend that wokeness actually could have a very objective definition behind it. Moving on to number 3 is an interesting thing I like to call the reversal test. So I found the most self-contradictory part about wokeness, which is that it's inherently consequentialist despite claiming to care about equality as a principle, is also one of the aspects of wokeness that makes it easiest to spot, because this creates a focus on group equity that requires them to apply totally different rules to people depending on whether they are perceived as being a member of the victim class or the oppressor class. Or in simpler words, wokeness is inherently hypocritical. A good example is the recent bout of Disney wokery, which is blackwashing Ariel. A part of me honestly doesn't care about this because Disney remakes are always terrible, and I'm not really going to watch them anyway. I admittedly was not going to watch this movie no matter what, but what's fascinating about it is the slew of extremely hypocritical and contradictory statements and arguments I'm seeing come out of the left in defense of it. Obviously, if whitewashing is considered bad, and cultural erasure is considered bad, then why is it magically good when it is done to whites? The answers they give to this vary, ranging from colonialism to prejudice plus power, with my personal favorite being them saying you should be colorblind to this, when of course colorblindness is something that woke scolds normally viciously oppose. And then they immediately flip to saying it's a good thing because representation, completely failing to realize that these 2 points completely and obviously contradict each other. So the simple test you can give any representation character is to simply reverse it. Ask the wokes if they would be okay with taking a character who belongs to what they consider a victim class and changing them into a member of the oppressor class. The answer, of course, is that they are not okay with it at all, because having no consistent principles whatsoever is again a feature of wokeness, not a bug, and because it's a feature, in a way that makes the wokes consistently inconsistent, and that you can pull this role reversal in just about anything they do and make, and easily detect their nonsense. The fourth indicator of wokeness I'll go over is something that's related to the reversal test, which is hostile or spiteful identity politics. This is best understood by example through examining the character Aster from High Guardian Spice, which in case you don't know is a critically panned fake anime known for being unintentionally kind of comedic due to how poorly written and over-the-top woke it is. It's actually kind of funny in that sense. Aster is a character who exists for the sole purpose to be hated. He is every toxic masculinity stereotype that wokes complain about, cranked up times 10. As a way for the authors to project their disdain for the evil white male. In a way, spite characters can be seen as a corrupt version of the Mary Sue, while Mary Sues exist as a self-insert character for an amateur author to live out their power fantasies, kind of in the way from the third example I gave. Spite characters exist for the author to inject stereotypes of the type of people they hate into the story, purely so that they can abuse them and live out their revenge fantasies. This is somewhat related to the first method I mentioned about the reversal test, because in the vast majority of the time, spite characters will fail the reversal test quite spectacularly. For instance, say the authors of High Guardian Spice were instead white nationalists, and Aster was written as a black, and they then injected every hateful and negative stereotype about black people into him. This would absolutely not fly in the modern day at all, and the woke cancel mob would be raising their pitchforks and calling for the authors of this story heads on a platter. Probably not literally, but you get the idea. The point is that the existence of spite characters is pretty common in woke media. Sometimes they take this an extra step where it's not just a spite character, but a spite story, making a fictional tale where the entire plot of the story is basically just thinly veiled propaganda for Marxism and the conquest of bread, where the whole plot just kind of boils down to equality and virtue signaling of the current thing. Because an interesting side effect of the consequentialist nature of wokeness is that the morality of consequentialists is usually based on whether or not an action produces a result that garners social approval. I've kind of mentioned this before, talking about Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development and how some people essentially get stuck at stage 3, where they think right and wrong is just entirely what their peers say, and they never progress their philosophical understanding and implication of ethics beyond this short-sighted notion that right and wrong are dictated entirely by what the masses say it is. In fact, when you try to explain this to them, they actually get confused. They'll actually argue, oh yeah, that's what right and wrong is. You're crazy to say otherwise. Well, no, actually. It's a way of thinking that values optics above truth, basically. That's not to say optics are not important. They are, and we should care about them to the extent that we do not make public spurgs of ourselves like certain people do. But optics should never be confused for actual morality, as history has proven that these concepts are completely different, often outright opposed. The fifth and last identifier of wokeness I want to mention is one that brings us away from the world of fiction and back to reality, which is a tendency for the cult of woke to utilize the tactic of professional victimhood. In other words, false or heavily exaggerated accusations and allegations of harassment for the pure purpose of just gaining power. This is more or less another result of demanding equitable outcomes, in an ideology where equal amounts of diversity, equity, inclusion is the end goal for all groups. One way for a person to gain power within that framework is to essentially race to the bottom, to claim to be a victim of society, to claim to be the ultimate victim of society, to claim to be someone who has the least of those three things, and to, of course, demand and guilt-trip others who subscribe to woke ideology into providing you with special treatment as a result. Donate to my Patreon. I personally find this to be a very interesting phenomenon because when you think about it, it's really an intersection of wokeness and grifting. A good example of this can actually be seen in a professional victim that Destiny had to deal with, believe it or not. I won't mention the name because this person honestly deserves as little attention as possible in my opinion, but to put it short, it was very impressive just the absolute scale of lies and grifts the individual pulled to maintain their victim status, to the point where it becomes more accurate to just assume that everything they said or will say in the future is most likely not true. Professional victims make use of various strategies in order to gain victim status and guilt people into giving them fame and fortune. They make heavy use of the criticism equals harassment grift, where all criticism against their actions is intentionally interpreted in bad faith. They are often pathological liars, and they will also sometimes try to generate harassment against themselves if they aren't getting enough attention by basically a strategy of poking the bear, which is a tactic where they will go to a community that is known for not being politically correct, and then say something towards that community that is incredibly foolish and inflammatory in order to garnish some kind of negative reaction out of them, which of course they can then use to cry harassment and gain victim points. It's an obvious grift once you are aware of it, but sadly a lot of people still fall for this scam pretty hard. And truth be told, you don't necessarily need to be woke to be a professional victim. I have seen conservative professional victims and non-woke professional victims. I mean, professional victim it has a very long history to it, but so you can definitely pull this grift off from other ideologies. It's just so happens that woke ideology makes it an especially easy grift to pull off, because you don't actually need to prove that any specific event makes you a victim in the land of woke. Instead, you simply have to prove that you are a member of one of their protected classes, the class that doesn't have enough diversity, equity, inclusion directed towards them, the victim class, because it's very easy to occupy the role of the victim class, as from that position you can basically spew whatever bullshit you want, and everyone just has to clap and accept it. Otherwise, you just falsely accuse them of harassing you, and of course use this manufactured grievance to beg for more Patreon subscribers. And from that, one thing you can kind of realize from this last method, and kind of all of these methods of detecting wokeness, is that a lot of woke scolds don't actually really believe what it is they're saying. They're just kind of pretending to go along with it because they think it makes them look good. So anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like and subscribe, and all that stuff. Until next time.